The air was crisp in London that morning, as Jonathan Rivers stood in the middle of the community center he had helped establish. The place bustled with energy. Volunteers sorting through donations, offering food to the homeless, and filling the air with the hum of quiet conversations. For Jonathan, this was his sanctuary, the place where he found purpose. It was where he could quiet the guilt that had followed him for years, ever since he chose a reckless path in his youth, leaving behind a trail of regrets. The walls of the center, adorned with thank you notes from families and children, were a stark contrast to the cold streets outside. Jonathan moved through the crowd with ease, offering smiles and words of encouragement to those he recognized from previous visits. His hands were quick to help carry boxes or offer a friendly pat on the back, always looking for the next person he could lift up. It was the least he could do, after all, given how lost he had once been. As he made his way toward the food station, he caught a glimpse of her. At first, it was a fleeting recognition, like seeing a shadow of a memory from a different life. A woman stood by the donation tables, carefully folding clothes and handing them to families in need. She moved with quiet grace, her focus entirely on those she was helping. Jonathan paused mid-step, something pulling at him from deep within. That face, it was familiar, achingly familiar, but he couldn't quite place her. His gaze lingered on her as she bent down to offer a coat to a little girl, her smile warm and genuine. Her long, chestnut hair cascaded down her shoulders, catching the light in a way that seemed oddly nostalgic. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. It couldn't be her, could it? Shaking off the absurd thought, he turned his attention back to the task at hand, though his mind kept wandering back to the woman. As the morning went on, he found himself glancing in her direction more than he intended, a strange sense of déjà vu hanging in the air. It was unsettling. Jonathan prided himself on his focus, especially when it came to these events, yet something about this woman was different, familiar. Finally, when the crowd had thinned out and the volunteers were wrapping up, he saw his chance. She was alone by the donation table, reorganizing the remaining clothes. Jonathan hesitated for a brief moment, then walked over, his footsteps barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. "Hi," he said, his voice steady but curious. "Thank you for helping out today. I don't think we've met before." The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his, and in that instant, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. His breath caught in his throat. Those eyes, dark, deep, and filled with something he couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe? But then she smiled, a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm Grace," she said softly, extending her hand. "It's my first time volunteering here. I'm glad I could help." Jonathan took her hand, feeling the strange sensation of a forgotten connection. "Jonathan," he introduced himself, his mind racing, trying to place her. "Grace." The name echoed in his memory, but the harder he tried to focus, the blurrier it became. "It's good to have you," he managed, his voice a bit softer now, distracted. "Have we met before?" The question was out before he could stop himself. Grace blinked, her expression faltering for a split second before she shook her head lightly. "No, I don't think so." She glanced away, focusing on the clothes again, but there was something in her body language, a stiffness that hadn't been there before. Jonathan could feel the moment slipping away, a lost opportunity. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to pursue it, but something inside told him that this was important. Maybe it was the echo of the past, the way her presence stirred something inside him that he had buried long ago. But he didn't push. "Well, I'm glad you're here," he said, offering a smile, though his mind was still spinning. "We could use more people like you." Grace's eyes flicked back to his for a moment, her expression softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'm just trying to do my part." With that, the moment was gone, and she turned back to her work, leaving Jonathan standing there, a strange sense of loss settling over him. He didn't know what it was about her, but something felt unfinished, like he had just crossed paths with a ghost from a life he had long since abandoned. He wanted to ask more, to understand why she seemed so familiar, but the opportunity had slipped away, leaving only the haunting feeling that their encounter was far from over. As Jonathan walked away, his mind replayed the brief conversation, trying to piece together the fragments of memory that now gnawed at him. Grace. Why did that name feel so important? And why did he feel like he had just missed something crucial? Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business as he walked away from Grace that day. Her face lingered in his thoughts, her voice echoing faintly in the corners of his mind. There was something about her, something in the way her eyes had momentarily met his before she looked away, that left him restless. Over the next few days, Jonathan tried to focus on his charity work, burying himself in the tasks that usually gave him peace. But each time he closed his eyes, it was Grace he saw. It didn't help that he began seeing her more frequently at the center. Grace had started coming regularly to volunteer, and though they hadn't spoken much since their first brief conversation, Jonathan found himself watching her from a distance. She moved through the crowded halls of the shelter with quiet efficiency, handing out food and helping those who needed it without drawing attention to herself. She was kind, gentle with everyone she encountered, but there was a sadness in her that Jonathan couldn't ignore. It pulled at him, even though he knew nothing about her. One evening, as the event wound down and the last of the volunteers were packing up, Jonathan noticed Grace struggling to gather a large bundle of clothes into a donation bag. Without thinking, he stepped over to her, offering his help. "Let me give you a hand with that," he said, already reaching for the bag before she could protest. Grace looked up, a bit startled by his sudden presence. "Oh, it's fine, really. I've got it," she replied, her voice soft but insistent. Yet, Jonathan noticed the slight tremble in her hands as she tried to lift the heavy bag. She wasn't as strong as she pretended to be. "Nonsense," he said with a smile, effortlessly picking up the bag and tossing it over his shoulder. "Where do you need it?" Grace hesitated for a moment before nodding toward the storage room in the back. "Just over there, thanks." Jonathan carried the bag across the hall, sensing her eyes on him as he did. Once the task was done, he turned to find Grace still standing there, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt thick, charged with something unspoken, and Jonathan could feel the questions bubbling up inside him. But instead of asking what was on his mind, he tried a different approach. "You've been coming here a lot lately," he said casually, breaking the silence. "I don't think I've seen someone so dedicated since I first started." Grace gave a small shrug, looking down at her hands as if unsure what to say. "It helps," she said after a pause. "Being here, it helps to keep my mind off things." Jonathan sensed the weight behind her words, the strain of a life that was much harder than she let on. He had seen it before, in others who came to the center. Not just the people they served, but some of the volunteers, too. Many of them were trying to heal, to find purpose or redemption for their own scars. Something inside him shifted, the connection he'd been searching for suddenly becoming clear. Grace wasn't just another volunteer. She was someone trying to rebuild, and he knew that struggle all too well. "Look," Jonathan began, his tone soft but sincere. "If you ever need anything, more than just the work here, help with something personal, don't hesitate to ask. I know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. You don't have to go through it alone." Grace's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something there. Vulnerability, perhaps, or maybe gratitude. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by the guarded expression she wore like armor. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, but I'm fine. Really." Jonathan didn't push. He could see that she wasn't ready to let anyone in, at least not yet. But as she turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Something that caught both of them off guard. A little girl, no older than 5, came running up to Grace, her tiny hands clutching the edge of her coat. "Mommy, are we going home now?" the child asked, her voice sweet and innocent. Grace froze, her back stiffening as she glanced quickly between the girl and Jonathan. "Yes, Olivia," she said, her voice suddenly tight. "We're going home." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. Mommy? He hadn't known Grace had a child. And now, looking at the little girl, Olivia, as Grace had called her, Jonathan felt something stir deep inside him. Olivia had large, dark eyes and a smile that was somehow both shy and mischievous at the same time. There was an odd sense of familiarity in her features, something he couldn't quite place. "You're her mother?" Jonathan asked, trying to keep his tone casual, though inside, his mind was racing. Grace's lips pressed into a thin line, her posture more defensive now. "Yes," she said shortly, pulling Olivia closer to her. "It's just the two of us." Jonathan nodded, forcing a smile even as his thoughts spiraled in 100 different directions. "She's beautiful," he said quietly, looking at Olivia, who was now hiding behind her mother's legs. "Thank you," Grace murmured, her guard still firmly in place. She tugged gently at Olivia's hand. "We should be going." "Of course," Jonathan said, stepping back to give them space. "Take care, Grace. And remember, if you ever need anything—" But Grace was already walking away, her shoulders tense as she guided Olivia toward the door. Jonathan watched them go, feeling a strange sense of loss as they disappeared into the night. His offer to help still hung in the air, unanswered, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. As he turned back to the now empty shelter, his thoughts were consumed by a single question. Why did Olivia feel so familiar? The following week, Jonathan found himself returning to the charity center with renewed focus, yet his thoughts continually circled back to Grace and the little girl, Olivia. There was something about the child that stirred an unease in him, a tug at a memory he couldn't fully grasp. Each night since meeting them, Olivia's face had haunted his dreams, leaving him with the unsettling sensation that he was missing a crucial piece of a puzzle he didn't even know existed. Despite his attempts to focus on the work that normally brought him peace, his mind drifted toward Olivia. Who was she, really? And why did the sight of her spark such a strange feeling in him? It wasn't just her appearance, though those dark, inquisitive eyes held a familiarity he couldn't shake. It was the way she had smiled, the shy tilt of her head that seemed almost intimate. He couldn't explain it, but he knew there was more to this. Grace continued volunteering regularly, and although they exchanged polite greetings, Jonathan noticed she kept a deliberate distance. Olivia, on the other hand, had started to appear at the center more often, accompanying her mother with childlike curiosity as she clung to Grace's side. The little girl was quiet but observant, always watching, always listening. Jonathan couldn't help but feel drawn to her, as if something invisible was pulling them closer. One afternoon, after most of the volunteers had left and the center was winding down, Jonathan spotted Olivia sitting alone at one of the tables in the corner. She was busy coloring in a book someone had left out for the kids, her small hands carefully holding the crayon as she worked. Grace was across the room, deep in conversation with another volunteer, her back turned to them. Taking a deep breath, Jonathan walked over to Olivia, not wanting to seem intrusive but feeling an overwhelming need to talk to her. As he approached, Olivia looked up, her eyes meeting his with that same innocent curiosity he had noticed before. "Hey there," Jonathan said softly, crouching down to be at her eye level. "What are you drawing?" Olivia hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether to trust him. Then, slowly, she pushed the coloring book toward him. "A house," she said in a small voice. Jonathan smiled. "That's a beautiful house. Is it your home?" She shook her head, her dark curls bouncing slightly. "No, it's just a house I imagined." "Well, it looks like a lovely place," Jonathan replied, feeling a strange warmth spread through him. "Do you like to draw?" Olivia nodded, a shy smile tugging at her lips. "Mommy says I'm good at it." "She's right," Jonathan agreed, his voice soft and encouraging. "You're very good at it." For a few moments, they sat in comfortable silence as Olivia continued to color, and Jonathan watched her, feeling something unexpected bloom inside him. An inexplicable bond. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but being near her felt, right? Like this was where he was supposed to be. "Do you come here a lot?" Olivia asked suddenly, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "I do," Jonathan said. "I help out here as much as I can. What about you? Do you like coming here with your mom?" Olivia shrugged. "It's okay. Mommy says it's important to help people, but sometimes I get bored." Jonathan chuckled softly. "Yeah, I can understand that." Before he could say more, Grace's voice cut through the room. "Olivia," she called, her tone sharp with concern as she hurried toward them. Olivia's face tightened, and she instinctively moved closer to Jonathan, her small hand clutching the edge of the table as if for security. Jonathan noticed the shift immediately, sensing the tension between mother and daughter. "Come on, Olivia. We need to go," Grace said, her eyes avoiding Jonathan's as she reached for her daughter. But Olivia didn't move. She looked up at Jonathan, her expression hesitant. "Can he come with us, Mommy?" The question caught both adults off guard. Grace froze, her hand hovering mid-reach, her face a mix of surprise and something else, something darker, like fear. "Olivia," Grace started, her voice tight. "We've talked about this." Jonathan felt the tension rise, and he quickly stood up, trying to diffuse the situation. "It's okay, Olivia. I'm sure your mom has things she needs to do." Olivia's face fell, but she nodded quietly, sliding off the chair and taking her mother's hand. Grace's gaze flicked to Jonathan for a brief moment, and he saw it again. That same guarded, almost haunted look she had given him before. "Thank you," she said quickly, her voice strained, "for keeping her company." "No problem," Jonathan replied, though he could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. He watched as Grace led Olivia toward the door, their silhouettes casting long shadows in the dim light of the room. Just as they were about to leave, Olivia glanced back at him, her large eyes filled with something that tugged at Jonathan's heart. She didn't say anything, but her gaze lingered, as if she were silently asking for something more. Then, in an instant, she was gone, the door closing softly behind them. Jonathan stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door, his thoughts swirling. The bond he felt with Olivia was undeniable, and yet he couldn't explain it. Why did being around her feel so natural? Why did it seem like they were connected in a way that defied logic? And then, it hit him. The realization was slow, creeping in at the edges of his mind until it slammed into him with full force. The timeline, the age of the child, the guarded way Grace interacted with him. It all began to fall into place. Could Olivia be? Jonathan's breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest as the pieces started to connect. He had never asked Grace about her past, but now, more than ever, he needed to know. Because if what he was beginning to suspect was true, his life was about to be changed forever. Jonathan barely slept that night. His mind was racing, consumed by the possibility that had been slowly creeping into his consciousness since his encounters with Grace and Olivia. Could Olivia be his daughter? The thought seemed impossible, yet it gnawed at him relentlessly. The timelines, the familiarity in the little girl's eyes, and Grace's constant guardedness. All of it was beginning to add up in a way that left Jonathan feeling both hopeful and terrified. By morning, the restlessness had turned into resolve. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him. The next day at the center, Jonathan arrived early, his nerves thrumming under the surface as he scanned the room for Grace. When she finally walked in, Olivia by her side, Jonathan's heart clenched. Every time he looked at that little girl, he felt an undeniable pull, a connection he couldn't explain. He waited until Grace was alone, watching as she sent Olivia off to play in the corner with some of the other children. Taking a deep breath, Jonathan approached her. "Grace," he called softly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. She turned to face him, her expression immediately tightening as if she knew this conversation was inevitable. "Jonathan," she greeted him cautiously, her eyes flicking toward Olivia before meeting his again. "Is something wrong?" For a moment, he hesitated, unsure how to begin. But there was no turning back now. He needed the truth. "I need to talk to you." "About Olivia," he said, his voice low but firm. Grace's body stiffened. "What about her?" Jonathan could feel the tension between them, like a taut string ready to snap. He glanced over at Olivia, who was now happily engrossed in a game with the other children, completely unaware of the storm about to break. Swallowing hard, he turned back to Grace. "Is she mine?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Grace's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her face paling as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. "Jonathan," she began, but her voice cracked, betraying the emotion she had been holding back. She looked away, her hands trembling as she tried to compose herself. Jonathan felt his chest tighten as he watched her struggle with the weight of the truth. "Please, Grace," he urged, stepping closer. "I need to know." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time since their paths had crossed again, Grace's carefully constructed walls began to crumble. She met his eyes, and in them, Jonathan saw the depth of her pain, her guilt, and something else, something like fear. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "She's yours." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jonathan staggered back a step, his breath catching in his throat. He had suspected it, but hearing the words spoken aloud hit him like a sledgehammer. His mind raced, trying to process the reality of it all. Olivia, his daughter. His daughter. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out harsher than he intended, but he couldn't hold back the surge of emotions flooding through him. Anger, hurt, confusion. "Grace, I had a right to know." Grace flinched at the intensity of his words, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she stood her ground. Her eyes filling with tears she clearly didn't want to shed. "I couldn't," she said, shaking her head. "Back then, you were on a destructive path, Jonathan. I didn't think you were ready to be a father. I didn't want Olivia to get hurt because of the choices you were making." Jonathan felt the sting of her words, the truth of them hitting harder than any accusation could. He knew what she was talking about, how reckless he had been, how lost. The years he had spent drowning in bad decisions, shutting out the world, and spiraling into darkness. He had been a different man then, consumed by his own pain and mistakes. But still, the betrayal burned. "You should have told me," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. "I could have been there. I could have been part of her life." Grace looked away, wiping at her eyes as she tried to gather her composure. "I didn't know how to tell you. By the time I realized I should, it felt like it was too late. And then, you disappeared. I didn't know where to find you, and I didn't want to open old wounds." Jonathan's heart twisted at her words. He had left, yes. After everything fell apart, he had walked away from that life, trying to find a way to start over. But in doing so, he had unknowingly left behind something far more important than he could have imagined. His eyes drifted over to Olivia, who was laughing with the other children, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm brewing between her mother and the man she didn't know was her father. Jonathan's chest ached with a mix of joy and sorrow. He had a daughter, a beautiful, vibrant little girl, but he had missed out on so much of her life. The thought was almost unbearable. Grace's voice pulled him back from his thoughts. "I'm sorry, Jonathan," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant to keep her from you. I thought I was doing what was best for her. But maybe I was wrong." Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions inside him. He couldn't change the past, and neither could Grace. But now, standing here, faced with the truth, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to lose Olivia again. "I want to be part of her life," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "I don't care how difficult it is, Grace. She's my daughter, and I'm not walking away this time." Grace looked at him, her eyes red and swollen from holding back tears. She nodded slowly, her resistance finally breaking. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll figure it out. For Olivia's sake." Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle over him, but with it came a sense of relief, too. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were years of absence, of hurt and misunderstandings to overcome, but he was ready to face it. He was ready to fight for his daughter, for the family he hadn't known he had. As Grace turned to call Olivia, Jonathan watched them together. The woman he had once loved and the daughter he had only just discovered. His heart swelled with emotion, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like his life was about to take a new direction, one filled with hope, pain, and redemption. The weight of the revelation hung over Jonathan like a dark cloud, suffocating and inescapable. Olivia was his daughter. The reality of it was still sinking in, twisting his thoughts, overwhelming his every emotion. Grace had walked away with Olivia after their conversation, leaving Jonathan standing alone in the dimly lit charity center, reeling from the truth. Now, A few days later, Jonathan found himself pacing in his apartment, his mind consumed by the enormity of it all. He had a daughter who had grown up without him. Every missed birthday, every milestone, every precious moment, gone. How could he ever make up for that? The pain gnawed at him, and with it came a deep anger. Anger at Grace for keeping the secret, but also anger at himself for not being there, for not fighting harder to stay connected to her all those years ago. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could be there now. He would be there now. Jonathan had no choice but to face the reality of his newfound fatherhood head-on, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be. The next time he saw Grace, it was at a small cafe not far from the charity center. She had agreed to meet him after much hesitation, and now they sat across from each other at a small table, the awkward silence between them thick with tension. Jonathan spoke first. "How do we tell her?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if saying the words out loud would make the situation even more real. Grace sighed, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice tight. "I've tried to think of how to explain it to her, but every time, I just can't find the right words." Jonathan stared at her, his mind racing. "She deserves to know the truth, Grace. We can't keep it from her any longer." "I know," Grace replied, her voice cracking. "But how do I explain why I didn't tell her sooner? How do I make her understand why I made the choices I did?" Jonathan could hear the pain in her words, and despite his own anger, he softened. "We'll figure it out. Together. But she needs to hear it from both of us." Grace nodded, though her expression was filled with doubt. "What if she hates me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jonathan shook his head, reaching across the table to gently touch her hand. "She won't hate you. She might be confused and hurt, but we'll work through it. We have to." Grace looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears, and for the first time since their reunion, Jonathan saw the depth of her fear. She wasn't just afraid of how Olivia would react. She was terrified of what this would mean for their fragile family. Later that evening, Jonathan found himself standing outside Grace's apartment. He had been invited to join them for dinner, a chance for him to spend time with Olivia before they broke the news. His heart pounded in his chest as he knocked on the door, unsure of how the evening would unfold. Grace opened the door, offering him a small, hesitant smile. "Come in," she said softly, stepping aside to let him in. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting, the soft scent of home-cooked food filling the air. Olivia was already at the dining table, her small frame leaning over a drawing she was working on. When she saw Jonathan, her face lit up with a smile, and she waved excitedly. "Hi," she called out, her voice bright and cheerful. Jonathan felt his heart swell as he waved back. "Hey, Olivia, what are you working on there?" She held up the drawing proudly, showing off a colorful picture of a family standing outside a house. "It's a picture of me and Mommy," she explained, her eyes shining. "But there's an empty spot. I haven't decided who else should be in it yet." Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat at her innocent words. He wanted to be in that picture. More than anything, he wanted to be part of her life. But how could he fill the empty space when she didn't even know the truth about him? Dinner was a quiet affair, filled with small talk and awkward silences. Jonathan tried to engage Olivia as much as possible, asking her about school, her friends, and the things she liked to do. She responded with enthusiasm, seemingly happy to have him there, but Jonathan could sense Grace's unease throughout the meal. The weight of the secret they were keeping from Olivia hung heavily between them, and Jonathan knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. After dinner, Olivia ran off to her room to play, leaving Jonathan and Grace alone in the living room. The silence between them was thick, and Jonathan could feel the tension building. "Are we really ready to tell her?" Grace asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Jonathan nodded, though the knot in his stomach told him he was just as nervous. "She deserves to know. We can't hide it anymore." Grace took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she stood up. "I'll get her," she said quietly. Jonathan watched as Grace disappeared down the hallway, and a moment later, Olivia returned, holding her mother's hand. She looked up at Jonathan with wide, curious eyes, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Olivia," Grace began, her voice soft and gentle, though it wavered with emotion. "There's something we need to talk to you about. Something very important." Olivia's face scrunched in confusion, but she sat down on the couch between them, looking from her mother to Jonathan, waiting for an explanation. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to find the right words. He had never imagined he would have to tell his own daughter who he was, but here he was, on the verge of revealing the biggest secret of her young life. "Olivia," he said gently, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him, "there's something I need to tell you, something about who I am." Her eyes grew wider, her small hands gripping her mother's tightly. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Jonathan took a deep breath, glancing at Grace for reassurance before turning back to Olivia. "I'm your father," he said softly, the words hanging heavy in the air. "I didn't know until recently, but I've always wanted to be part of your life." Olivia stared at him, her face blank with shock as she processed the information. For a long, excruciating moment, she said nothing, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find the truth in his words. Then, slowly, her lip began to tremble, and tears welled up in her eyes. "But why? Why didn't you come before?" she asked, her voice breaking with hurt. Jonathan felt his heart shatter at the pain in her voice. "I didn't know, sweetheart. I didn't know about you. If I had, I would have been here." Olivia's tears flowed freely now, her small body trembling as she clung to Grace. "Why didn't you tell me, Mommy? Why didn't you tell me?" she cried, her voice filled with confusion and betrayal. Grace's face crumpled with guilt, and she pulled Olivia into her arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed. "I'm so sorry, baby," she whispered through her tears. "I thought I was doing what was best. I didn't want you to get hurt." Jonathan watched helplessly, his heart breaking as the reality of the situation unfolded before him. He had found his daughter, but in doing so, he had also opened the door to a world of pain and confusion for her. It was a moment he had dreaded, and now that it had arrived, he realized just how fragile their path to healing would be. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty, tension, and emotional exhaustion for all three of them. Jonathan had expected the truth to shake Olivia, but nothing could have prepared him for the overwhelming guilt that settled in his chest as he watched her wrestle with the reality that her life, her understanding of her family, had changed in an instant. Olivia barely spoke to him after that night. She had clung to Grace in tears, confused and hurt by the revelation. Jonathan's heart ached every time he saw her. Every time her innocent eyes reflected a world of pain and betrayal he wished he could erase. He wanted nothing more than to hold her, to tell her everything would be okay. But he knew that building a bridge between them would take time and patience. Grace, too, was struggling. Jonathan could see the way her guilt weighed on her, the way her once steely resolve had cracked under the pressure of keeping the secret for so long. Every time their eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Both had made mistakes, and both were paying the price for them now. Sitting alone in his apartment late one night, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about Olivia. The image of her tear-streaked face haunted him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had already lost her. How could he, a stranger in her life for so many years, ever hope to earn her trust? He had missed everything. Her first words, her first steps, her first day of school. He had missed the laughter, the bedtime stories, the small moments that would have made him a part of her world. Now, all he had was the promise of the future, and it terrified him. What if Olivia never accepted him? What if she never forgave him for being absent, even if it wasn't his choice? His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Grace. "She wants to see you tomorrow. Let's meet at the park." Jonathan stared at the screen, his heart racing. A part of him was relieved. Olivia wanted to see him. But the other part, the one consumed by doubt and fear, wondered what she might say. Was she ready to talk? Or was this the beginning of an even greater distance between them? The next afternoon, Jonathan arrived at the park early, the weight of anticipation heavy in his chest. It was a crisp autumn day, and the trees surrounding the playground were bursting with vibrant shades of red and gold. Families dotted the area, parents watching their children play, laughter filling the air. But for Jonathan, the world felt still, as if everything around him had faded into the background. He spotted Grace and Olivia approaching from a distance. Grace's face was tense, but Olivia's was unreadable. The little girl clutched her mother's hand tightly, her gaze fixed on the ground as they walked. Jonathan stood up from the bench, unsure whether to smile, wave, or do nothing at all. When they reached him, Grace gave him a small nod before stepping back to let Olivia stand between them. There was an awkward silence, and Jonathan's heart pounded as he looked at his daughter, waiting for her to say something, anything. Finally, Olivia spoke, her voice small and uncertain. "Why didn't you know about me?" The question cut through Jonathan like a knife, but it wasn't unexpected. He had been preparing for it, replaying every possible answer in his mind. Still, hearing it from Olivia's trembling lips made the reality of the situation all the more painful. Jonathan crouched down to her level, his voice soft and filled with the weight of his regret. "Because I wasn't told, Olivia. I didn't know, but I wish I had, more than anything in the world." She looked at him with wide, questioning eyes, her face still etched with the confusion of a child trying to make sense of a world turned upside down. "You didn't want me?" she asked, her voice trembling with vulnerability. Jonathan felt his heart shatter all over again. "No, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I always would have wanted you. I just didn't know you were out there. If I had known, I would have been with you from the very beginning." Olivia shifted on her feet, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. "Mommy said you weren't ready to be a dad." Jonathan's gaze flicked to Grace, who stood a few feet away, her arms crossed as she watched them with a mixture of guilt and protectiveness. He knew she had tried to explain it in the best way she could, but it didn't make it any easier. "I wasn't ready back then," Jonathan admitted softly, his eyes returning to Olivia's. "But I am now, and I'll be here for you, no matter what. I promise." For a long moment, Olivia said nothing, her little face scrunched in thought. Jonathan's heart raced, each second feeling like an eternity as he waited for her reaction. Finally, she looked up at him, her expression still unsure, but there was something softer in her eyes. "Okay," she whispered, though the word carried a weight that made Jonathan's chest tighten with emotion. It wasn't full acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. He smiled, relief flooding him. "Okay," he echoed softly. Grace stepped forward then, her face tight with emotion as she knelt down beside Olivia, placing a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We're going to take this slow, Olivia," she said gently. "It's a lot to understand, but we'll get through it. Together." Olivia nodded, her little hand reaching up to grasp Grace's. For the first time since the revelation, Jonathan felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to navigate this together. It wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to fight for his daughter, no matter how long it took. As they sat together on the park bench, watching the other children play, the silence between them felt less heavy. Jonathan glanced at Olivia, who was still holding her mother's hand tightly but now seemed a little more at ease. She didn't pull away when he spoke to her, and even though her responses were still brief, there was a tentative connection beginning to form. Time, that's what they needed. Time to heal, time to rebuild trust, time to become a family. After a while, Olivia looked up at him, her big eyes filled with a question. "Can we play on the swings?" Jonathan's heart swelled with joy. "Of course," he said, his voice light with relief. Grace smiled softly, stepping aside as Jonathan and Olivia walked toward the swings. As they reached the playground, Jonathan lifted her gently onto the swing, pushing her with the careful attention of a father learning the rhythms of a relationship he had only just begun. Her laughter, soft at first, grew as she swung higher, and for the first time in days, Jonathan felt something inside him ease, a glimmer of hope, a sign that they could start to move forward. The days following their talk at the park felt like walking a tightrope for Jonathan. His relationship with Olivia was delicate, fragile in a way that made every moment with her feel both precious and uncertain. She had opened a small door to him, allowing him to be part of her life. But Jonathan knew better than to assume the hardest part was behind them. In truth, this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, and there were still many wounds left to heal. Olivia, in her own quiet way, was trying to adjust. She would ask him to push her on the swings, or she'd smile shyly when he complimented one of her drawings. These little moments felt like victories to Jonathan, each one a sign that maybe, just maybe, he could earn her trust. But beneath the surface, he could feel the hesitation in her, the questions she didn't yet know how to ask. Grace, on the other hand, was harder to read. Jonathan could sense her watching from a distance, her protective instincts still strong. She hadn't outright pushed him away since the revelation, but she kept an emotional distance, as though she was waiting for something to go wrong. It was a tension that Jonathan didn't know how to resolve. One evening, a few weeks after the park, Jonathan had been invited over for dinner again. He arrived early, as he often did, hoping to have a little time with Olivia before the meal. Grace opened the door, offering him a small, polite smile, but Jonathan could feel the weight of unspoken thoughts between them. "Olivia's in her room, finishing up some homework," Grace said, stepping aside to let him in. "Thanks," Jonathan replied, glancing toward the hallway. He hesitated, unsure if he should head straight to Olivia's room or wait. The awkwardness of navigating this new dynamic with Grace lingered in the air, and it frustrated him more than he cared to admit. Grace must have sensed his hesitation because she spoke again, her voice quieter now. "She's been talking about you a lot, you know?" Jonathan's heart leapt at her words, though he kept his expression neutral. "Yeah? What's she been saying?" Grace looked down at her hands, fiddling with a dish towel as she spoke. "She's confused but curious. She wants to understand who you are and why you weren't around before. I try to explain it in a way she can understand, but—" She paused, her voice trailing off as she sighed. "It's hard." Jonathan felt the familiar pang of guilt settle in his chest. "I know. I wish I could go back and change things, Grace, but I can't. All I can do now is show her that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes finally meeting his. "That's what I'm afraid of." Her words hung in the air like a weight between them. Jonathan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Grace took a deep breath, her voice wavering slightly as she spoke. "I know you're trying, Jonathan, and I believe you want to be part of Olivia's life. But what happens when things get hard? What if she gets too attached and then you decide it's too much? What if you walk away again?" Jonathan's chest tightened at her words. He had anticipated this, the doubt, the fear that he wasn't truly capable of staying, but hearing it spoken aloud hit harder than he expected. He understood Grace's hesitation, but it didn't make the accusation any less painful. "I'm not going to walk away," Jonathan said firmly, his voice steady. "I know I wasn't there before, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But I'm here now. I'm not leaving, Grace." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether to believe him. There was a long pause, and Jonathan could feel the weight of her fears pressing down on both of them. "I hope you're right," Grace whispered, turning back to the kitchen. Jonathan stood there for a moment, the silence heavy in the room, before he made his way down the hall to Olivia's room. As he approached the slightly ajar door, he heard the soft scratch of pencil on paper, followed by Olivia humming quietly to herself. He knocked gently, pushing the door open. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "What are you working on?" Olivia looked up, her face lighting up as she saw him. "I'm drawing a picture for my teacher," she explained, holding up the paper. It was a colorful scene of a house surrounded by flowers, with a bright blue sky overhead. "That's beautiful," Jonathan said, smiling as he walked into the room. "You're really good at drawing, Olivia." She grinned, clearly pleased by the compliment. "Do you want to help?" Jonathan's heart swelled at the invitation, and he sat down beside her at the small desk. "I'd love to." For the next hour, they worked together in comfortable silence, Olivia occasionally asking him to help with a detail or to color in a flower. Jonathan cherished every second of it, each moment feeling like another step toward building the relationship he so desperately wanted with his daughter. But even in these quiet moments, Jonathan could sense the uncertainty that still lingered beneath the surface. Olivia was trying, just as much as he was, but the unspoken questions, the lingering doubts, were still there. He could see it in the way her smile faltered at times, or how she hesitated before asking him a question. Later that night, after Olivia had gone to bed, Jonathan and Grace sat together in the living room, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. Jonathan couldn't hold it in any longer. "Do you really think I'll leave?" he asked quietly, breaking the silence. Grace didn't answer right away. She stared down at her hands, her brow furrowed in thought. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but filled with emotion. "I don't know," she admitted. "I want to believe you, Jonathan. I do. But it's hard to forget the past." Jonathan felt a wave of frustration rise in him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not the same person I was back then, Grace. I've changed." "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But people don't always stay." Jonathan's chest tightened. He understood her fears. How could he not? She had raised Olivia alone, protected her, and built a life for the two of them. And now, with Jonathan back in the picture, everything was uncertain again. "I'm not going anywhere," he repeated, his voice firm. Grace nodded, but her expression was still clouded with doubt. "I guess only time will tell." Jonathan stayed a little while longer, but the tension between them was palpable. As much as he wanted to bridge the gap between them, he knew that Grace's trust wouldn't be won easily. She had spent years building walls around herself and Olivia, and tearing those down would take time. As he left that night, walking into the cool evening air, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he tried, there would always be a part of Grace that doubted him. But he wouldn't give up. Not on her, and certainly not on Olivia. He had lost too much already. He wasn't about to lose them again. Jonathan had been doing everything in his power to stay close to Olivia. Every weekend, he planned activities they could do together, from trips to the zoo to simple afternoons in the park. Each moment with her felt like a small victory, another step toward building the relationship he so desperately craved. Olivia had started to warm to him, slowly but surely. She would hold his hand, ask him questions about his life, and sometimes even rest her head on his shoulder when she was tired. But beneath those tender moments, Jonathan knew there was still a fragile thread of uncertainty. Olivia was curious, hungry for answers that neither he nor Grace had fully given her. She was a bright, perceptive child, and it was only a matter of time before she started asking the difficult questions. That moment came sooner than Jonathan expected. One afternoon, after a particularly long day at the park, Jonathan had just driven Olivia back to Grace's apartment. They had shared laughs and stories, and the day had felt like one of their best yet. As they approached the door, Olivia tugged at his sleeve, her small face twisted in a serious expression that made Jonathan's heart tighten. "Dad," she said. The word still new to both of them, but one she had started using more frequently. "Can I ask you something?" Jonathan knelt down, meeting her at eye level. "Of course, sweetheart. What is it?" Olivia bit her lip, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Why weren't you here when I was little? Did you not want to be my dad?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut, even though he had been bracing for it. He had known this moment would come eventually, but nothing could have prepared him for the weight of hearing it from her. "No, Olivia," Jonathan said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I always would have wanted to be your dad. I just didn't know about you. Your mom didn't tell me until recently." "But why?" Olivia's eyes were wide, pleading for an explanation that made sense in her young mind. "Why didn't she tell you?" Jonathan hesitated, his gaze shifting toward Grace's apartment. He knew the answer, but it wasn't his place to explain everything. "Your mom did what she thought was best at the time," he said carefully. "I wasn't in a good place back then, Olivia. I made a lot of mistakes, and I wasn't ready to be a father." "But you're ready now?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jonathan nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "Yes, I'm ready now. And I promise you, I'm here to stay. I'll always be here for you, no matter what." Olivia seemed to consider his words, her young mind working through the complexities of the situation. But Jonathan could tell that she wasn't fully satisfied with the answer. There were still pieces missing, pieces she wasn't ready to understand yet. Later that evening, after Jonathan had left, Olivia approached Grace with the same questions. The conversation started gently, with Olivia asking why her mom hadn't told Jonathan about her sooner. But as Grace struggled to find the right words, the frustration and confusion that had been building in Olivia for weeks began to bubble to the surface. "Why didn't you let him be my dad?" Olivia demanded, her voice sharper than Grace had ever heard it. "He said he didn't know about me, that he wasn't ready. But why didn't you tell him?" Grace's heart ached at the accusation in her daughter's voice. She had always known this moment would come, but now that it was here, she felt utterly unprepared. How could she explain the choices she had made? Choices that were meant to protect Olivia but had ultimately caused her pain. I didn't think he was ready, Olivia," Grace said softly, her voice trembling. "Back then, Jonathan was going through a lot. He wasn't in a place where he could take care of you, and I wanted to keep you safe. But you didn't even give him a chance." Olivia cried, her small hands balled into fists at her sides. "You didn't let him decide. You just decided for him." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes, the guilt she had carried for so long now boiling over. "I was scared, Olivia. I was scared that he wouldn't be able to handle being a father, and I didn't want you to get hurt. I thought I was doing the right thing." "But you lied," Olivia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You lied to me, and to him." Grace's heart shattered at the truth in her daughter's words. She had lied, not maliciously, but out of fear and desperation. But now, that lie had come back to haunt her, and the damage was already done. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Olivia." Olivia stared at her mother, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I just wanted my dad," she whispered, her voice filled with the quiet heartbreak of a child who had missed out on something precious. Grace reached out to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I know, baby," she whispered, her own tears falling freely now. "I know, and I'm so sorry." For a long time, they stayed like that, Grace holding Olivia as they cried together, the weight of their shared pain settling between them. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes for the hurt that had been caused by years of secrets and misunderstandings. But in that moment, Grace realized that the only way forward was through honesty. She couldn't undo the past, but she could make sure that Olivia knew the truth from here on out. The next time Jonathan came to visit, the atmosphere was different. Olivia was quieter, more withdrawn, and Jonathan could sense the shift immediately. He hadn't been part of the conversation between Grace and Olivia, but he could tell something had changed. "Is everything okay?" he asked Grace quietly as Olivia played in the other room. Grace sighed, running a hand through her hair. "We had a long talk," she admitted. "She asked me why I didn't tell you sooner, and I had to explain it all to her." Jonathan's stomach tightened. How did she take it? "Not well," Grace said softly, her eyes filled with regret. "She's hurt, Jonathan. She feels like we've both lied to her." Jonathan's heart sank. He had expected this, but hearing it was still painful. He hated that Olivia was caught in the middle of something so complicated, something that wasn't her fault. "She needs time," Grace added. "She's trying to understand, but it's hard for her." Jonathan nodded, his gaze drifting toward Olivia's room. "I'll give her all the time she needs," he said quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." As the days passed, Olivia remained distant. She still spent time with Jonathan, but the light in her eyes had dimmed. She was grappling with the truth, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become much more complicated. Jonathan knew he couldn't rush her. He had to be patient, even though it broke his heart to see her struggling. One evening, after dinner, Olivia finally spoke. "Dad," she said softly, looking up at Jonathan with wide, uncertain eyes. "Yeah, sweetheart," he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "Can we start over?" she asked, her voice small but filled with hope. "Can we just pretend that we're meeting for the first time and try again?" Jonathan's throat tightened with emotion. He could see how hard this was for her, how much courage it had taken for her to ask that question. "Of course," he said gently, his voice filled with love. "We can start over. However you want, Olivia." And in that moment, Jonathan realized that while they couldn't erase the past, They could build something new, something stronger, built on honesty and trust. It wouldn't be easy, but they were moving forward, together. The days after Olivia's request to start over marked a subtle but meaningful shift in their relationship. Jonathan could see her making the effort, meeting him halfway, as if she, too, was eager to bridge the gap that had kept them apart for so long. They spent more time together, visits to the library where Olivia could lose herself in books, long walks in the park where they talked about her dreams and her friends at school. It wasn't always easy, but they were trying. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt hope, a fragile, precious hope that they were on the right path. But as Jonathan and Olivia worked on building their bond, another tension was growing, one he couldn't ignore. Grace had become distant, her smiles tight and her eyes shadowed with a worry she didn't voice. Jonathan could see the way she watched them, standing back as if unsure where she fit into this new dynamic. She had given him the space to reconnect with Olivia, but it was clear that something was weighing on her, something she was holding back. One evening, after Olivia had fallen asleep, Jonathan sat down with Grace in her small living room. The quiet of the night enveloped them, but the air between them felt charged, heavy with unspoken words. "Grace," Jonathan began, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk." Grace didn't look up at first. She was sitting on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. "About what?" she asked, though her tone made it clear that she already knew. "You've been distant," Jonathan said. "Ever since Olivia and I started spending more time together, I can feel it. You're pulling away." Grace sighed, finally lifting her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were tired, filled with a sadness that made Jonathan's heart ache. "I'm just trying to give you two space," she said softly. "You need time to get to know each other." "That's not it," Jonathan pressed, his voice low but steady. "There's more to it than that. What's going on, Grace?" For a moment, she didn't answer. She seemed to be searching for the right words, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared, Jonathan." The admission hung between them, fragile and raw. Jonathan leaned forward, his expression softening. "Scared of what?" "Of losing her," Grace said, her voice trembling. "I've raised her on my own for so long. It's always been just the two of us. And now you're here. She's bonding with you, and I can see how much she needs you. But what if I lose her? What if she chooses you over me?" Jonathan stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always known that Grace's relationship with Olivia was deeply protective, but he hadn't realized just how much fear lay beneath that protectiveness. She had been everything to Olivia for so many years. Their entire world had revolved around each other. And now, Jonathan's presence threatened to upend that delicate balance. "You're not going to lose her," Jonathan said gently, his voice filled with sincerity. "Grace, she loves you. You're her mother, and nothing is going to change that." Grace shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "But what if she starts to resent me? What if she blames me for keeping you out of her life? I can already see it sometimes, the way she looks at me when she's upset, like she doesn't understand why I didn't tell her sooner." Jonathan felt a pang of guilt. He knew that Olivia was still processing the truth, that she was wrestling with feelings of confusion and betrayal. But he also knew that Grace had done what she thought was best at the time, even if those decisions had come at a cost. "Olivia's going through a lot right now," Jonathan said softly. "She's trying to understand everything, and it's going to take time. But that doesn't mean she's going to push you away. She needs both of us, Grace. We can do this together." Grace's shoulders slumped, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear. "I don't know how to let go," she admitted. "I've been her whole world for so long, and now I don't know how to share her." Jonathan leaned in, his voice steady and filled with quiet conviction. "You don't have to let go. You're still her mother. That's never going to change. But we need to work together, for her sake." Grace nodded slowly, but Jonathan could see the doubt still lingering in her eyes. She wanted to believe him, but years of being Olivia's sole protector had made her wary, guarded. She wasn't sure if she could truly open herself up to this new arrangement, this idea of a shared parenthood. The days passed, And while Jonathan and Olivia's bond continued to grow, the distance between him and Grace remained. She tried to hide it, but Jonathan could feel it every time they spoke. Her lingering fear that he would take Olivia away from her in some emotional, irreversible way. It all came to a head one night when Olivia, curious and innocent as she was, asked a question that pierced through the fragile peace they had built. "Mom, why didn't you want Dad around when I was little?" The room went still. Grace froze, her face paling as she looked from Olivia to Jonathan, clearly caught off guard. Jonathan's heart sank. He had known this question would come eventually, but hearing it from Olivia's lips, so direct and yet so innocent, felt like a wound reopening. I didn't want to keep him away, Olivia," Grace said, her voice shaky. "I thought I was doing what was best for you." "But why?" Olivia pressed, her wide eyes filled with confusion. "Didn't you think he could be a good dad?" Grace's face crumpled, and for a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Jonathan watched helplessly, his heart aching for both of them. "I was scared," Grace finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was scared that if I told him, he wouldn't be ready. I didn't want you to get hurt." Olivia looked between them, her small face filled with the weight of emotions far too complex for someone her age to fully understand. "But he is a good dad," she said softly, almost as if she were trying to convince herself. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her voice breaking. "He is. He's a wonderful dad, Olivia. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry." The room was thick with emotion, the air heavy with the weight of years of misunderstanding and hurt. Jonathan could see the pain in Grace's eyes, the guilt that had been eating away at her for so long. He wanted to reach out, to say something that would ease the burden she carried. But there were no easy words, no quick fixes. Instead, he knelt down beside Olivia, his voice soft but filled with love. "Your mom did everything she could to protect you, Olivia. She loves you more than anything in the world, and so do I. We both made mistakes, but we're here now, and we're not going anywhere." Olivia looked at both of them, her eyes wide and filled with a mixture of emotions, fear, confusion, but also hope. Slowly, she nodded, her small hand reaching out to grasp both of theirs. And in that moment, Jonathan realized that while the road ahead would be difficult, they had a chance to rebuild, to heal, not just for Olivia's sake, but for all of them. The weeks following that emotional evening were a turning point for all of them. Jonathan could feel the fragile threads that had once held their family together begin to weave into something stronger. Olivia was more open now. She smiled more, laughed more, and each day brought her closer to Jonathan in a way that filled him with a deep sense of joy. But even as they moved forward, Jonathan knew there was still one final hurdle they had to face before they could truly heal: trust. Grace had spent so many years protecting herself and Olivia, building walls around the two of them to keep their world safe. And while Jonathan had earned Olivia's trust, Grace's was still something that felt just out of reach. He saw it in the way she looked at him, soft but cautious. She had let him back into their lives, but there was always that lingering fear, a question hanging in the air that neither of them had yet confronted. One evening, after a long day spent with Olivia, Jonathan found himself sitting across from Grace at the kitchen table. Olivia had gone to bed, and the house was quiet, but the silence between them felt like the calm before a storm. He could sense it, the unspoken words they had been avoiding for weeks. "Grace," Jonathan began, his voice steady but quiet, "we need to talk. Really talk." Grace looked up from her cup of tea, her eyes wary but resigned. "I know," she said softly. "I've been waiting for this." Jonathan leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her. "I need to know where we stand. I need to know if you can trust me again." Grace was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with the weight of everything she had been holding back. "It's not that I don't want to trust you, Jonathan. It's just, I've been doing this on my own for so long. It's hard to let go of that, to let someone else in." "I understand that," Jonathan replied, his tone gentle but firm. "But I'm not here to take anything away from you. I'm here to be part of this with you. For Olivia. For us. Grace's eyes softened, but the fear in them was still there, lingering at the edges. What if it doesn't work? What if you change your mind? I'm not going anywhere, Jonathan said, his voice filled with conviction. I know I missed a lot, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for that. But I need you to believe that I'm in this for the long haul. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, struggling to keep her emotions in check. I want to believe you, Jonathan. I do. But it's hard to forget how much it hurt when you left before. I'm scared that if I trust you again, you'll leave, and it'll break Olivia's heart. And mine. Jonathan's heart clenched at her words. He had never fully understood the depth of her fear until now. How much his absence had scarred her. How hard she had fought to keep their world intact. But he knew that if they were going to move forward, they had to face that pain head-on. Grace, he said softly, reaching across the table to take her hand. I know I can't change the past, but I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. Not ever. I love Olivia, and He hesitated for a moment, his voice thick with emotion. I still love you. Grace's breath caught, and she looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The words hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded. The truth that had been buried for so long finally coming to the surface. I never stopped loving you, Jonathan continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Even when everything fell apart, you were always in my heart. And now, with Olivia, I want us to be a family. I want to try again. Grace's tears spilled over, and she looked down, her hands trembling as she wiped at her eyes. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know if I can open myself up like that again. What if we get hurt? We'll get hurt, Jonathan said gently, his eyes filled with understanding. There will be hard days, and we'll make mistakes. But that's part of life. And I'd rather face those hard days with you and Olivia than spend my life wondering what could have been. Grace looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. She didn't say anything for a long time, but Jonathan could see the battle playing out in her mind. The war between her heart and her fear of being hurt again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. I don't know if I'm ready to just jump into this, but I want to try. For Olivia. And for us. Jonathan's heart swelled with relief and joy, and he smiled softly. That's all I'm asking for. A chance. They sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the past slowly lifting as they shared this fragile, hopeful moment. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning, a step towards something new. The next morning, Olivia woke up to find both her parents sitting at the kitchen table, talking softly, their smiles light but genuine. She walked over, rubbing her sleepy eyes, and climbed into Jonathan's lap without a word, resting her head on his chest. Good morning, sweetheart, Jonathan said, kissing the top of her head. Did you sleep well? Olivia nodded, still half asleep, and snuggled closer. Grace watched them, her eyes filled with a quiet happiness that Jonathan hadn't seen in her for a long time. Later that day, they decided to go for a walk together as a family. As they strolled through the park, the sun shining down and the crisp autumn air swirling around them, Olivia ran ahead, laughing as she chased a fluttering leaf. Jonathan and Grace followed behind, walking side by side, their hands occasionally brushing against each other's. It was a simple moment, but it felt monumental. A sign that maybe, just maybe, they were on their way to becoming the family they had always been meant to be. As they sat on a park bench, watching Olivia play, Grace leaned her head on Jonathan's shoulder, a small but significant gesture that made his heart swell with hope. I'm glad you're here, she whispered. I'm glad too, Jonathan replied, his voice thick with emotion. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. They had a long road ahead of them, full of challenges and uncertainties. But they would face it together, as a family. And that was all that mattered. 6 months had passed since that fateful conversation at the kitchen table, and life had slowly settled into a new rhythm for Jonathan, Grace, and Olivia. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of uncertainty, days when the past felt too heavy to ignore, but they had learned to navigate it together as a family. Olivia, in her quiet, resilient way, had blossomed with both her parents by her side. Her laughter came more easily now, her joy contagious as she embraced the world around her. She still asked questions from time to time. About the years before Jonathan came back, about what it meant to have two parents who loved her after so long of only having one. But those questions no longer carried the same weight of pain. Instead, they were met with honesty, love, and patience. Jonathan, too, had changed. He was no longer the man haunted by the mistakes of his past, but someone who had found peace in being present, in rebuilding the relationships he had once lost. He still carried guilt, of course, guilt for the years he had missed, for the moments with Olivia that had slipped through his fingers, but each day was a chance to make up for it. And each day, he did just that, with love and quiet determination. Grace had softened in ways she hadn't thought possible. The fear of losing Olivia, of being replaced, had faded into the background. It hadn't been easy, but with each passing day, she had come to trust Jonathan again. Slowly, but surely, the walls she had built around herself had begun to crumble. She no longer carried the burden of being both mother and father. Now, she shared that weight, and with it, she found space for something new, hope. On a cool spring morning, the three of them sat together on the porch of Grace's home, watching as Olivia played in the yard, her laughter echoing through the crisp air. The flowers in the garden were beginning to bloom, the first signs of new life after a long winter, and the sunlight danced through the trees, casting soft shadows across the grass. Jonathan sat beside Grace, their hands entwined, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his lips. He glanced over at her, his heart full as he took in the sight of her, the woman he had once loved so fiercely and whom he had never truly stopped loving. Grace caught his gaze and smiled back, the warmth in her eyes unmistakable. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "How lucky I am," Jonathan replied, his voice filled with quiet sincerity. "How lucky we are." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, her eyes drifting back to Olivia, who was now chasing a butterfly through the yard. "Yeah," she murmured, "we are." They sat there in comfortable silence for a while, watching their daughter, the soft hum of the world around them filling the air. There was no rush, no urgency, just the quiet, steady peace of knowing that they were exactly where they were meant to be. For the first time in years, they weren't defined by the pain of the past. They were a family, imperfect, but whole. And as they sat together, the future stretched out before them, full of possibility. They didn't know what challenges lay ahead, but they knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Because now, they had each other. And that was enough.